Jesus is baptized in the Jordan River, but why? This story can be confusing to many readers, and I understand why. Let's talk about that here. Hi, I'm Michael Barber. I'm professor of biblical studies and theology at the Augustine Institute Graduate School in St. Louis, Missouri. And let's talk about the significance of Jesus being baptized by John in the Jordan River, which is a feast we're about to celebrate here on the Christian calendar. Now, the gospel writers tell us that John the Baptist was, quote, preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. That's Mark 1:4. So if John the Baptist's baptism was for the forgiveness of sins, does this mean that the gospel writers believe that Jesus was baptized because he had been sinful? It's tempting as a critical scholar to just say, yep, obviously Jesus is sinful in the Gospels, and it's only later Christian theology that turns him into someone who is sinless. But the problem with that is it's not just later Christian theology that holds that Jesus was without sin. Paul, who writes earlier than the Gospels, calls Jesus the one who knew no sin in 2 Corinthians 5:21. And the point there doesn't seem especially controversial or new. Paul he just kind of mentions it in passing. It seems like he's saying something readers are already aware of. In fact, many scholars even think that Mark reflects Paul's own theology. So while we like to talk about the differences in the New Testament, sometimes that's overblown. There's been a lot of good work on scholarship showing relationships between Mark and Paul. So thinking that the gospel writers don't describe Jesus' baptism because they think he's sinful isn't some reactionary theological move. There are critical reasons for thinking something else is going on in the story. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus clearly knows who he is at the age of 12. And so in the Gospel of Luke, it doesn't seem that Jesus' baptism represents his own conversion. That's a tough sell. And also in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, Jesus makes a statement that no one knows the Father except the Son. No one knows the Son except the Father. This unique relationship between the Father and the Son, with other details in the Gospels I don't have time to get into here, point to Jewish beliefs about a pre-existent Messiah. All of this makes it unlikely that Jesus views himself in the story as a converted sinner at his baptism. In addition, in Mark 13, Jesus says that no one knows the day or the hour of judgment, not the angels, not even the Son of Man, not even him, the Son of God. This doesn't really work well with the idea that Jesus and Mark is just simply a sinful human who had a conversion experience at his baptism. The Gospels have details that point away from the idea that Jesus was a sinner. Instead, he's a model of piety. And there are lots of other details here we could get into. I don't have time to get into, but I think one of the biggest problems that we have when we think about John's preaching of a baptism of repentance is that we read it as nothing more than the kind of preaching you might hear at kind of like a big tent revival meeting, where repentance is simply construed in terms of an individualistic reality. And this is because we, in our context, typically think of salvation in atomistic terms. Salvation is just me and God. But this kind of thinking is the legacy of the Protestant Reformation and, in a more general way, modern thought. Ancient Jews were not simply thinking about repentance in individualistic terms. Yes, they thought of personal contrition, but they also thought of the need of the conversion of all of God's people. Ancient Jews didn't simply think in terms of God save me. Yes, there's that, but they were also concerned with God saving Israel. See, for example, the prayer of the prophet Daniel in the book of Daniel 9. There, the prophet prays to God, "We have sinned and have done wrongly, acted wickedly and rebelled, turning aside from your commandments and ordinances. We have not listened to your servants, the prophets, who spoke In your name to our kings, our princes, and our ancestors, and to all the people of the land. That's Daniel 9, 5 through 6. Notice here, it's not just I have sinned. Daniel sees himself as part of a larger people of Israel, part of a larger story. He's concerned for the whole people of God. He goes on to pray to God, incline your ear, oh my God, and hear, open your eyes and look at our desolation and the city Jerusalem that bears your name. Daniel 9:18. And in fact, the story of Jesus in the Gospels of his baptism points to this kind of broader perspective. Now, it begins with John preaching to the crowds, and he's preaching not just to them as individuals, but as the people of Abraham. Notice what he says here. Bear fruits worthy of repentance. And do not begin to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our ancestor. For I tell you, God is able from these stones to raise up children to Abraham. So when we hear John's message of repentance, we shouldn't think of this merely in terms of the modern fixation on individualistic repentance. In fact, Jesus is presented again and again as a kind of new Moses figure in the Gospels. For more on that, you can see Dale Allison's book, The New Moses, and also see his more recent book, Interpreting Jesus. Guess what Moses famously does on behalf of the people of Israel? He seeks to make atonement for Israel's sin, for their sin of idolatry, a sin he did not participate in. In the baptism of John, there's a concern for the whole people of God here. And rather than reading the story simply as Jesus's personal conversion story from sin, there's good reason to think that Jesus's baptism is especially related to these broader concerns. More on this in the next video. Now, be sure to subscribe, like, and follow so that you don't miss more videos on this topic and other videos like them. Tell the algorithm that you want to hear more videos like this so you don't miss them. Thanks so much.